Welcome back, dreamers. I hope you're set up to hear more disturbing tales. Before you drift to sleep, tell me in the comments from where you're listening from. 8 years ago, when I was a sophomore in high school, my friends and I were in the thick of our urban exploration phase. We loved the thrill of finding forgotten or abandoned places around our town to explore, hoping to uncover bits of history or just have an adventure that broke up the routine of school life. It became a weekend ritual, grabbing our bikes, backpacks loaded with essentials, and heading out to discover whatever the town's neglected corners had to offer. On one particular afternoon, with the sun just beginning to dip lower in the sky and casting long shadows, we set off without any concrete destination, just a vague plan to explore the more rundown part of town. Our group that day consisted of 5 of us: me, Mike, Josh, Amanda, and Sarah. We pedaled through familiar streets, our bikes rattling over cracked pavement and past old industrial sites that were long past their prime. The area was a blend of the forgotten and the barely functioning, boarded up warehouses with broken windows, overgrown lots where weeds and small trees had taken over, and chain-link fences with rusted holes that showed just how little the area was maintained. It was the kind of place that felt alive in its decay, as though every crumbling building had stories to tell. As we rode, our conversation shifted from school gossip to what we hoped to find. Mike joked about stumbling across hidden treasure, while Amanda talked about wanting to take some good photos for her art class. I remember the air being heavy with the smells of damp earth and old oil, a scent that always seemed to linger in this part of town. We were all in high spirits, laughing and half racing each other down the quiet streets, until Josh, who was in the lead, called out for us to stop. He had spotted something just off the road, a gaping, shadowy hole set into a hillside, almost hidden behind overgrown brush and leaning, rusted signs. We parked our bikes against a sagging fence and made our way over to inspect it. Up close, it became clear that this wasn't a natural cave, but a man-made structure. The entrance had a rough, irregular shape, as if it had once been more defined but had eroded and crumbled over time. Cement walls lined the opening, jagged and cracked, and the ground leading into it was a mix of loose stones and packed dirt, with a few stubborn weeds poking through. The temperature seemed to drop the closer we got, and the cool, musty air that drifted out had a stale, almost metallic tang to it. We all stood there for a moment, a mix of excitement and apprehension passing between us. Even in daylight, the cave's interior was pitch black, and our flashlights, standard, cheap ones we'd picked up at a convenience store, barely made a dent in the darkness. The light revealed graffiti right near the entrance, the usual mess of names, dates, and amateurish drawings, some of which were already fading or peeling with age. The walls were damp, and water dripped from somewhere deeper inside, echoing through the cavern and making the place feel even more desolate. We ventured in cautiously, just a few steps, careful not to trip over the uneven ground. Our voices dropped to hushed tones as we tried to get a sense of the space. The sound of our footsteps was unnervingly loud, echoing back at us, and the darkness felt heavier the deeper we looked. We didn't go far that day, only about 20 or 30 feet in, before we all agreed that we'd need proper gear if we wanted to explore further. The air was thick with dust and particles, and it quickly became hard to breathe. Even in those brief moments, I could feel it sticking to my skin, and the thought of going deeper without any kind of protection didn't sit well with any of us. As we emerged back into the sunlight, we were already planning our return trip. We'd need better flashlights, respirators, and maybe something to mark our path to make sure we didn't get lost. The idea of going back into that cave excited us, even as we joked about the creepy feeling it gave off. It felt like we'd stumbled onto something special, a secret waiting to be uncovered, and we couldn't wait to come back and explore it more thoroughly. We pedaled away, the cave's shadowy entrance burned into our minds, a challenge we were eager and maybe a bit nervous to face. Equipped with our new gear, we felt ready, or at least more prepared, to face the depths of the old cement mine. The 5 of us had gathered at the entrance that late afternoon, each of us loaded with flashlights, extra batteries, cheap respirators, glow sticks, and snacks tucked away in our backpacks. The air around the mine was colder than we remembered, and a faint breeze seemed to whisper out of the entrance, carrying with it the same damp, metallic scent that had unsettled us the first time. We all exchanged nervous glances, but our determination held steady. After one last check of our equipment, we took a collective breath and stepped into the darkness. The moment we crossed the threshold, it was like stepping into another world. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the sunlight faded quickly behind us. We flipped on our flashlights, the beams slicing through the dust-laden air, but even the brighter lights we'd bought only managed to illuminate a small area around us. The dust particles danced in the beams, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. We adjusted our respirators, feeling the rubber straps dig into our skin, but they were necessary. The air was thick, heavy, and almost suffocating. The main shaft sloped gradually downward, its walls lined with the rusting remains of old equipment. Abandoned carts, broken conveyor belts, and twisted, corroded pipes. Everything was covered in a film of grime and dust, a testament to how long it had been since anyone had cared for this place. Our footsteps echoed oddly, sometimes fading too quickly, other times bouncing back to us as if the mine itself were alive, responding to our presence. The sense of isolation deepened the further we went, with the entrance and daylight quickly disappearing from view. The graffiti that had covered the walls near the entrance was familiar in its casualness, a patchwork of names, dates, simple doodles, and the usual X was here messages left by previous explorers. But as we continued our descent, the colorful spray paint gradually vanished, and the bare cement walls took on a stark, unwelcoming quality. We knew we were venturing past the point where most people had dared to go, and that thought alone sent a shiver down my spine. We had a system for marking our way. Every 50 feet or so, we'd crack a glow stick and leave it on the ground. The problem was, the thick, dusty air swallowed the glow almost immediately. By the time we walked just a few steps away, the sticks were barely visible, reduced to faint glimmers that offered little reassurance. It became increasingly clear that our backup plan wasn't as foolproof as we'd hoped. But we kept telling ourselves that the main shaft was simple and straightforward. "There's only one way in and out," Mike kept reminding us, though his voice sounded more uncertain as we got deeper. We tried to keep our spirits up by talking quietly, but the deeper we went, the more the mind seemed to muffle our voices, absorbing our words and making them sound small and hollow. Amanda occasionally pointed out strange shapes in the shadows cast by our flashlights, only to realize they were just rusted pipes or chunks of broken machinery. Josh couldn't help fidgeting, adjusting the straps on his backpack every few minutes, as if he needed something to do to keep from thinking too hard about where we were. The tension was building, even if none of us wanted to admit it. We had stopped joking around and started walking in near silence, each of us acutely aware of how vulnerable we were. The sound of dripping water became our constant companion, echoing in the cavernous space. We never saw where the water was coming from. The drips just reverberated around us, setting our nerves on edge. Occasionally, we'd hear the unsettling crunch of gravel or the clatter of a loose stone that one of us had kicked, making us jump and shine our flashlights in every direction. Just as the unease began to feel almost suffocating, we stumbled upon something that made us all stop in our tracks. Dug into the side of the main shaft was a narrow, jagged tunnel. It was small enough that we'd have to crouch and scramble to get through, and it was elevated a few feet off the ground. The tunnel looked rough, like it had been carved out long after the mine had been abandoned. But what made us freeze was the sudden reappearance of graffiti around the opening. The writing was nothing like the playful tags we'd seen earlier. It was stark and written in a hurried, almost desperate hand, with words that sent chills down our spines. Suffering, pain, plague, disease, and hell. The white paint seemed to glow eerily in the dim light of our flashlights, and we all exchanged uneasy glances. It wasn't just the words that unnerved us. It was the fact that someone had come this far into the mine, into this suffocating, oppressive darkness, just to write such disturbing things. The atmosphere seemed to shift, becoming even heavier, almost as if the mine itself was warning us to turn back. We stood there in silence, our flashlights trembling slightly in our hands. My pulse was pounding in my ears, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The tunnel loomed before us, a dark void that felt like it could swallow us whole. Our earlier confidence had eroded, replaced by a creeping dread that none of us wanted to voice. But despite the fear gnawing at the edges of our minds, there was a pull, a need to see what lay beyond. We had come this far, and the idea of leaving without finding out what was deeper inside felt almost unbearable. Our group stood there in tense silence, gathered around the narrow tunnel entrance, with its eerie words scrawled in white paint. No one said anything at first, but I could feel the collective sense of dread building among us. The words on the walls, suffering, pain, plague, disease, hell, seemed to hang in the stale, heavy air, and even our flashlight beams appeared to dim in the face of such ominous warnings. The entire scene felt wrong, like we'd stumbled onto something that wasn't meant to be found. After a long pause, we exchanged nervous glances, each of us trying to read the other's expressions for reassurance. Mike was the first to break the silence, his voice low and strained. "We're here now," he said, almost as if he was trying to convince himself more than us. His words sounded brave, but his grip on the flashlight was tight, his knuckles pale under the strain. We hesitated, our curiosity battling with the fear that sat heavy in our chests. Despite the growing tension, the pull of the unknown won out, and one by one, we agreed to crawl through the tunnel. The entrance to the tunnel was rough, requiring us to scramble and crouch awkwardly. The stone was cold under our hands, and the air inside was even heavier and more suffocating than before. Each movement stirred up dust, and our respirators strained to keep the particles out. The faint sound of our breathing amplified inside the masks. The tunnel wasn't long, but it was disorienting, and our flashlights struggled to light the way, casting shadows that seemed to flicker and shift along the walls. When we finally emerged on the other side, the space opened up into a large, eerie chamber. The first thing we noticed was the water. A pool of dark, stagnant water sat in the center, rippling slightly as drops fell from somewhere in the ceiling above. It was shallow near the edges, but seemed to deepen in the middle, the water murky and uninviting. The air was damp and cold, and the sound of dripping water echoed off the stone walls, creating a steady, unsettling rhythm. Surrounding the pool were large, flat stones, arranged almost deliberately. Each one was covered with dozens of burned-out tea candles, their wax melted and pooled in odd, uneven shapes. There must have been hundreds of used candles scattered around, remnants of rituals or gatherings we could only guess at. The stones felt cold and ancient, and the sight of so many burned-out candles made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was as if we'd stepped into the aftermath of something, a place where people had come for reasons that felt darker and more serious than we wanted to imagine. We cautiously walked around the chamber, our flashlight beams sweeping across the walls. The graffiti here was different from what we'd seen earlier. Crude, monstrous faces were painted on the stone, their eyes wide and mouths twisted into expressions of agony. The artwork was poor, almost childlike, but there was something deeply unsettling about the way the faces stared at us, frozen in silent screams. Near the tunnel we had just crawled through, the entrance was framed with a crude, spray-painted mouth dripping with what looked like red paint, meant to mimic blood. It felt theatrical, but also intentional, as if the person who painted it wanted to ward off or frighten anyone who ventured this far. The silence in the room was suffocating. Aside from the occasional drip of water, there was no noise, no signs of life, no distant echoes, just us, standing in this strange, ritual-like setting, surrounded by burned-out candles and haunting graffiti. The five of us stood close together, our flashlights trembling slightly. We whispered theories, trying to make sense of the scene. Was this some kind of meeting place for local Satan worshippers? A prank pulled by other explorers to scare people like us? The explanations we offered felt thin and unsatisfying. Amanda's voice wavered as she spoke, pointing out that whoever had been here had clearly intended for the site to feel menacing. The candles, the graffiti, the painted blood, it was all too deliberate. Josh suggested we try to find more clues, but none of us seemed eager to wander too far from the group. The space felt heavy, oppressive, as if the stone walls themselves were pressing in on us, urging us to leave. Our adrenaline was running out, replaced by a cold, sinking feeling that made the room feel darker and smaller by the second. We could all feel it, a collective sense of dread that made our decision for us. There was nothing left here for us to discover, and we no longer wanted to know who or what had made this room their own. One by one, we crawled back through the narrow tunnel, our hands and knees scraping against the cold stone, desperate to get back to the relative safety of the main shaft. When we emerged, the main tunnel felt almost welcoming in comparison, though the suffocating air and darkness were just as thick. We didn't speak much, just exchanged wide-eyed looks before turning and heading back the way we had come. The sight of the exit, a distant, faint glow of natural light, filled us with a sense of relief so strong it was almost overwhelming. As we made our way back into the real world, the heavy, unsettling feeling finally began to lift, but the memory of that room lingered. To this day, none of us have gone back, and we've never quite shaken the feeling of that strange, ritualistic chamber. The mystery of what we found in the heart of that mine remains unsolved, and I think we're all content to leave it that way. The fear, the darkness, and the sense that we had witnessed something we weren't supposed to see have stayed with us, a reminder of how close curiosity and terror can be. It was 8 years ago, back when my friends and I were still in high school and had a passion for exploring abandoned and eerie places. The stories about the old coastal fort had circulated around our town for years. Tales of ghostly sightings, strange sounds echoing through the corridors at night, and people who came back with unexplained injuries. It all sounded like the perfect mix of adventure and danger, so we couldn't resist the opportunity to see it for ourselves. We picked a bright afternoon for our expedition, thinking that the daylight would make the whole experience less intimidating. But as we made our way down the rugged path that led to the fort, there was something about the place that defied the sun's efforts to make it feel safe. The closer we got, the more the fort's massive, weathered stone walls seemed to absorb the light. We were met by a landscape that looked forgotten and weather-beaten. Wild grasses and weeds growing unchecked, rusted metal fences that had collapsed in places, and patches of moss covering large parts of the walls. The fort itself was perched on the edge of a cliff, with a stunning view of the ocean, but the crashing waves below sounded less soothing and more ominous. The wind blew in off the sea, carrying the sharp scent of salt and decay, and it whipped through the broken windows and cracks in the stone, making an eerie howling noise. As we approached the entrance, we had to climb over a section of crumbling fencing, our hands scraping against the rough metal, and our feet slipping on the loose gravel. We joked around to mask our nervousness, but the unease in the air was undeniable. Once inside the fort's courtyard, we paused to take it all in. The space was large, open, and eerily quiet, with overgrown plants pushing through the cracks in the stonework. Pieces of shattered glass from old windows lay scattered across the ground, and empty bottles and scraps of trash were evidence of other visitors who had come before us. A couple of old cannons sat rusting in their original positions, now just relics of a time long past, pointed uselessly toward the horizon. None of us wanted to be the one to admit that the place was getting under our skin, so we pushed forward, pretending to be braver than we felt. We decided to split up, a choice that in hindsight seems ridiculous, but at the time we thought it made sense. The fort was large, and we wanted to cover as much ground as possible. "Stay within shouting distance," I called out as we fanned out, trying to keep my voice steady. Mike headed toward the battlements, where narrow walkways wrapped around the perimeter of the fort, giving a view of the sea and the jagged cliffs below. Sarah made her way toward a cluster of low, crumbling buildings that looked like they might have once been officers' quarters or storage rooms. I lingered in the courtyard, drawn to a spot that seemed different from the rest. In one corner, I noticed a makeshift fire pit, with blackened stones arranged in a rough circle. The ashes inside were still there, undisturbed, and scattered among them were small fragments of paper that had been partially burned. Curiosity got the better of me, and I knelt down to take a closer look. The paper scraps were delicate, threatening to disintegrate at the slightest touch, but I managed to carefully piece together a few sentences. My eyes widened as I read. The letters seemed to be part of a story, a troubling one. They mentioned a man who had been released from prison on good behavior, with strict instructions to check in with authorities regularly. The tone of the writing grew increasingly desperate, hinting at some deeper pain, especially when it came to the man's children, whom he wasn't allowed to see. I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just random graffiti or harmless notes. It was the leftover fragments of someone's life. Someone who had been here, perhaps in turmoil. The weight of the place seemed to grow heavier as I stood there, clutching the charred fragments. The fort's silence, which had felt merely eerie before, now seemed suffocating. I became hyper-aware of how alone I was in that moment. The wind picked up, rustling through the weeds and making the old, rusted doors creak on their hinges. I glanced around, half expecting to see a figure standing in the shadows watching me. But the courtyard was empty, just an expanse of overgrown stone and the husks of long-abandoned structures. The realization that my friends were now deep in other parts of the fort only added to my growing unease. I could faintly hear Mike and Sarah's voices echoing from somewhere beyond the courtyard, distorted by the stone walls and the wind. The sense of isolation was overwhelming, and I felt a prickle of fear at the base of my neck. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just an old, abandoned fort. But the tension in the air felt almost tangible, and I couldn't help but feel like we had trespassed somewhere we didn't belong. The desperation in the words was stark, and phrases like unfit to be around my kids and unforgivable stuck out, sending a shiver down my spine. I tried to process what I was reading, but something about it felt disturbingly real, like the ghost of someone's troubled past had lingered here, embedded in these remnants. I swallowed hard, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the coastal breeze. The bright afternoon light now seemed muted, and the wind carried a biting edge as it whispered through the empty buildings. The sense of unease was growing, a creeping awareness that something about this place was profoundly off. Suddenly, a gust of wind caught one of the remaining paper scraps, making it flutter across the ground before getting caught in a crack between two stones. The movement startled me, and I realized just how jumpy I had become. I glanced around the courtyard, now painfully aware of how isolated I was. My friends were somewhere deeper inside the fort, and their distant voices had faded into silence. The realization that I could no longer hear them sent a fresh wave of anxiety coursing through me. I took a shaky breath, trying to steady myself, but every sound seemed amplified. The creak of rusted metal, the rustling of weeds, the distant caw of a seagull echoing off the stone walls. I knew I couldn't just stand there. With my nerves on edge, I stuffed the fragments of the letters into my pocket, feeling like I needed to hold on to this proof that I hadn't imagined what I'd seen. Then, almost reluctantly, I turned my gaze toward the entrance to the tunnels carved into the cliffside, the part of the fort that burrowed deeper into the earth. The darkness inside those tunnels seemed impenetrable, and the shadows stretched out like grasping fingers. The old stone archway leading into them was covered in moss, and rusty chains dangled from metal hooks, remnants of a gate that had long since fallen away. I hesitated, every instinct in my body screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't leave without my friends. They had ventured into those dark tunnels, unaware of what I had just discovered, and the idea of exploring those shadowy passageways alone was deeply unsettling. I took a tentative step forward, the crunch of gravel beneath my feet sounding unnaturally loud. My flashlight was small and not particularly strong, but it was my only defense against the oppressive darkness. I switched it on, the beam of light cutting through the gloom, illuminating damp stone walls streaked with moss and years of decay. The air in the tunnels was different, heavier, and with a musty, earthy smell that made it difficult to breathe. Every now and then, I could hear the slow drip of water echoing from somewhere deep inside, the sound carrying an eerie, rhythmic quality. The beams from my flashlight barely reached more than a few feet in front of me, and the shadows seemed to twist and shift at the edges of the light. The tunnel walls felt like they were pressing in, narrow and confining, and my footsteps echoed in a way that made it sound like something, or someone, was following just behind me. I tried to call out for my friends, but my voice came out quieter than I intended, swallowed up by the darkness. My heart was pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. I thought I heard a faint rustling noise up ahead, and I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. My flashlight beam shook as I held it out, trying to see further down the passage. Was it one of my friends, an animal, or something else entirely? My mind raced through possibilities, each one more unsettling than the last. Forcing myself to move forward, I kept calling out, my voice cracking slightly with each attempt. Eventually, I rounded a corner and almost walked straight into one of my friends, Mike. He jumped at the sight of me, and I could see the relief on his face mirrored my own. We were both on edge, and I quickly explained what I had found in the courtyard. His expression grew serious, and the tension between us was almost palpable. The story I told seemed to add to the fort's already oppressive atmosphere, and we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. As we stood there, trying to decide what to do next, every noise felt amplified. The distant drip of water, the faint creaks and groans of the fort's old wooden beams, and the rustling of unseen creatures. The tunnels seemed to close in on us, the air thick with the musty smell of decay. We had to find Sarah, who was somewhere further inside, and fast. The thought of splitting up again was out of the question, so we pressed forward together, jumping at every sound, the shadows around us seeming to come alive as we moved deeper into the fort. With Mike by my side, the oppressive weight of the fort's darkness felt slightly less overwhelming, but the anxiety gnawed at both of us. We pressed deeper into the tunnels, moving cautiously yet urgently, the feeble light from our flashlights casting long, jittery shadows on the damp, crumbling walls. The air seemed to grow even heavier, and every breath came with the musty scent of earth and decaying stone. Our footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sounds were bouncing back at us from unseen places, making it feel like something was following, just out of sight. We kept calling out for Sarah, our voices cracking with a nervous edge we couldn't hide. The tunnels twisted and turned, leading us further into the bowels of the fort, and it was easy to imagine how someone could get lost in this maze. Water dripped rhythmically from somewhere above, creating shallow puddles that splashed under our feet and added to the eerie soundtrack of the place. Every now and then we'd hear a creak or a distant rustling, and we'd stop dead, holding our breath and straining to hear any other signs of movement. Each time, the silence that followed felt even more unsettling. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we found Sarah. She was standing in one of the wider, open areas of the tunnel system, her flashlight beam shaking as she turned toward us. Relief flooded her face, but it was quickly replaced by a look of pure fear as she whispered that she had heard footsteps behind her just moments before we arrived. None of us wanted to acknowledge the possibility that we weren't alone, but the fear was palpable. The three of us huddled together, our flashlights darting around the cavernous space, illuminating damp stone, rusting metal supports, and tangled roots that had broken through the walls. The decision to leave was unanimous. We didn't bother trying to rationalize our fear anymore. The only thought now was to get out. We started retracing our steps, moving as quickly as we could without breaking into a full sprint, each of us hyper-aware of every creak and groan the fort made. The tunnels seemed to close in even more as we navigated the twists and turns, and the glow from our flashlights barely kept the encroaching darkness at bay. The shadows seemed alive, shifting and bending in ways that made it impossible to shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond our reach. When we finally emerged back into the courtyard, the daylight was fading, casting long, deep shadows across the overgrown expanse. The oppressive atmosphere of the fort didn't lessen, and we knew we still had to climb back over the crumbling walls to get out. The sense of urgency made us reckless, and in our rush to escape, things went from bad to worse. Mike was the first to try climbing out. His hands were trembling as he gripped the jagged stone, and in his haste, his foot slipped. We heard the sickening crunch as he landed awkwardly, his face contorting in pain as he clutched his foot. He'd broken 2 toes, and the look of shock and panic in his eyes made my own heart race even faster. Sarah and I tried to help him, but the fort didn't seem willing to let us leave without more injuries. As she attempted to climb the wall next, she lost her grip on a loose stone, and her shoulder slammed into the ground with a sickening pop. Her scream echoed off the fort's ancient walls, and I could see the tears of pain welling up in her eyes. Panic took over, and I made a desperate attempt to climb the wall myself, feeling the sharp edges of the crumbling stones biting into my hands. Just as I was pulling myself up, I slipped on a patch of moss and felt something slice into my hip. The pain was immediate and intense, and when I finally managed to pull myself over the wall, I could feel the blood soaking through my shirt. We were a mess of adrenaline, fear, and pain, but we finally managed to drag ourselves away from the fort, each step a struggle as we limped and stumbled back to where we had left our bikes. The relief of being outside the fort's walls was almost overwhelming, but none of us felt safe until we were far, far away from that place. We didn't stop moving until we reached the safety of a nearby parking lot, where we finally collapsed in a heap, our injuries throbbing and our breaths coming in ragged gasps. Years later, I still remember that day like yesterday. Over the past decade, my fascination with the abandoned East Coast insane asylum has only grown stronger. The sprawling complex, long forgotten and overrun by nature, feels like a place frozen in time. The buildings, built from crumbling brick and aged stone, are covered in creeping ivy, their shattered windows staring out like hollow, vacant eyes. Rusted fire escapes cling to the sides of the buildings, sagging under years of decay. On some visits, I've watched birds take off from the rooftops in a flutter of wings, the sudden movement startling in the otherwise still and silent environment. No matter how many times I returned, the sheer size of the asylum always felt overwhelming, like a small ghost town all on its own. The grounds surrounding the asylum have their own haunting character. Tall grasses sway in the wind, hiding uneven patches of earth and half-buried debris from when parts of the buildings collapsed. Trees have grown up in odd places, their roots cracking through old walkways and pushing up the concrete. Graffiti covers almost every surface that vandals could reach: walls, ceilings, door frames, and the messages range from careless tags to intricate, colorful murals. Many of the walls are adorned with eerie phrases like "turn back" or "they never left," which, even if left as jokes by other explorers, seem to echo the unsettling energy of the place. Each building has its own distinct aura. Some of the old patient wards still have rows of rusted bed frames and peeling paint that hangs in long strips, swaying slightly in the drafty hallways. The administration building is filled with smashed office furniture, broken file cabinets spilling their yellowed papers onto the floor. Other areas, like the kitchens and dining halls, are a chaotic mess of shattered dishes, rusted kitchen equipment, and overturned tables. The whole complex is a testament to years of neglect, but beneath the chaos, there's still an echo of the lives that were once lived there. What most people don't know about this asylum, though, is that its most unsettling feature lies underground, the network of tunnels connecting the buildings. I'd read and heard countless stories about the asylum, but I never saw anyone mention the tunnels. It felt like a secret I'd stumbled upon, something only a handful of explorers knew about. These tunnels weren't designed for exploration, but for function. They carried steam, water, sewage, and electrical lines, and they served as emergency passageways and service corridors for the staff. They run about 10 to 15 feet below ground and are accessible from various points throughout the asylum, often through hidden doors that are easy to miss. The first time I discovered one of these entrances was purely by accident. I had been exploring the asylum's post office, a large room with dusty wooden mail slots and piles of unopened letters strewn across the floor. I remember absent-mindedly tracing the wood paneling with my fingers when I felt a faint draft of cool air seeping through a seam. Leaning in closer, I noticed the seam was more pronounced than the others, like the panel wasn't quite flush with the wall. With a gentle push, the panel shifted, revealing a narrow doorway leading into darkness. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, trying to decide whether to step through or turn back. The tunnels themselves are a world apart from the buildings above. Once you step into that underground realm, the temperature drops sharply and the air becomes dense and heavy. It smells of mildew, wet concrete, and rusting metal, and there's a constant drip of water somewhere in the distance. The walls are bare concrete, streaked with grime and mold, and the floor is uneven, sometimes muddy from leaks that have seeped through the ground above. When it rains, the tunnels become even more treacherous, with puddles that can grow several inches deep and slick, algae-covered surfaces that are nearly impossible to walk on without slipping. Walking through these tunnels is disorienting. The light from your flashlight only illuminates a few feet in front of you, and beyond that, everything fades into a pitch-black void. The darkness is so complete that it almost feels like a physical presence, pressing in on you, reminding you how isolated and vulnerable you are down there. Even the strongest flashlight beams struggle to cut through the murky, dust-filled air, which always seems to be moving, even when there's no breeze. The light refracts oddly, making shadows seem to jump and shift at the edges of your vision, playing tricks on your mind. Sound behaves strangely underground, too. Every step you take echoes back in unpredictable ways, bouncing off the walls and making it hard to tell where the noise is coming from. If you drop something, a flashlight, a rock, anything, it can sound like it's crashing down from all directions. The dripping water creates an irregular, unsettling rhythm that only adds to the sense of unease. Sometimes the sounds are faint, almost imperceptible, like whispers coming from somewhere deep within the maze. Other times, the echoes of your own footsteps make it feel like there's someone or something following close behind you, always just out of sight. Despite the discomfort and danger, I couldn't help but feel drawn back to the tunnels each time I visited. There was a thrill to it, a curiosity that wouldn't let go. Every time I went underground, I couldn't shake the feeling that the asylum had more to tell, more secrets buried in the dark corners of this forgotten world. Exploring those tunnels alone was, in hindsight, a reckless decision. It wasn't the first time I had ventured into the asylum by myself, but I'd recently started to realize just how dangerous it could be. The tunnels, while fascinating, were also a potential death trap. There were countless ways things could go wrong, slipping on the wet, uneven concrete, getting caught in a cave-in, or simply becoming disoriented and lost. The thought of being trapped in absolute darkness, injured and unable to call for help, was always at the back of my mind. Yet, despite the risks, I often found myself returning, driven by an unexplainable curiosity. On my last solo visit, I made several critical mistakes. First, I went in alone, something I'd promised myself I'd stop doing. Second, I only had a small, low-powered LED flashlight, running on a single AA battery and emitting maybe 75 to 100 lumens. It was barely enough to light the way in front of me, and the thought of it running out was terrifying. I also didn't bring a backup light, and I knew that if the battery died, I would be in complete and total darkness, with no way of finding my way out. Still, I pushed these concerns aside and convinced myself I would be fine. I decided to explore a section of the tunnels that sloped downward toward the water treatment building. The path was treacherous from the start, with water leaking from above and collecting in slimy puddles on the floor. Every step I took was cautious, and I could hear the unsettling squelch of my boots against the muck, a sound that echoed back and forth between the tunnel walls. The deeper I went, the more the air changed, becoming colder and heavier, with a damp, musty smell that clung to my clothes and filled my lungs. It was hard to breathe down there, as if the air itself was pressing against me, trying to force me out. The tunnel led me further underground, the incline making it easy to slip if I didn't watch my step. The flashlight in my hand cast a weak, yellowish beam that barely cut through the dark, and the further I went, the more I realized just how inadequate it was. The shadows seemed to shift and dance at the edge of the light, and my eyes strained to pick out details in the gloom. Sometimes the concrete walls would be streaked with rust, creating patterns that almost looked like writing or strange symbols, but I knew it was just corrosion and the work of decades of water damage. The sense of isolation grew with every step. The entrance to the tunnels, and the faint light that had streamed in from above, was far behind me now, and the only sounds were my own breathing, the occasional drip of water, and the echo of my footsteps. The tunnel twisted and turned, and each new section brought with it a fresh wave of unease. I had to keep reminding myself to stay calm, to move carefully, and to be mindful of my surroundings. I tried to make mental notes of landmarks, like a large crack in the wall or a puddle that had formed into a specific shape, but it was easy to lose track in the uniform darkness. When I finally reached the end of the tunnel, I stepped into a large, cavernous room that I knew housed the old water storage tanks. The space was vast, the ceiling high and echoing, and it felt like stepping into another world. Two massive, rusted water tanks dominated the room, each one standing about 15 feet tall. The floor was covered in an inch or two of water, mixed with mud and debris, creating a slick, treacherous surface. As I walked, the muck made a sucking stuck noise under my boots, and I found myself moving slowly to avoid slipping. I paused in the middle of the room, sweeping my flashlight around to take in the details. The beam of light reflected off the damp walls, catching on droplets of water that clung to the metal surfaces and trickled down in thin, glistening streams. Rusted pipes snaked their way up the walls and across the ceiling, some dripping slowly, while others were covered in a slimy green moss. The smell of decay was stronger here, a pungent mix of mildew, rust, and stagnant water. The whole place felt oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in and the quiet was deafening. Then, something broke the silence. From the far side of the room, I heard a distinct noise. Shtuck! Shtuck! It was the sound of wet footsteps, just like the ones I had been making. My heart froze. The sound echoed off the walls, and I found myself gripping the flashlight tighter, my knuckles turning white. I swung the beam in the direction of the noise, but the light only revealed more darkness, bouncing off wet concrete and glistening surfaces. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate, as if someone or something was moving toward me. My mind raced. I was supposed to be alone down here. The asylum had been abandoned for decades, and it was rare to run into other explorers, especially in the tunnels. The footsteps weren't hurried or frantic. They were measured, as if whoever or whatever was making them had all the time in the world. I called out, my voice cracking in the cold, damp air, but there was no response. The only answer I received was the steady drip of water and the echo of my own words bouncing back to me. Every sense was heightened, my body tense and ready to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. I scanned the room again with my flashlight, the beam wavering, casting erratic shadows that made it even harder to see. My breath felt shallow, and I could hear my pulse pounding in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, that I was in danger, but I had no idea from what. The darkness felt alive, as if it were hiding something just beyond my line of sight, something I wasn't meant to see. Standing there in the dimly lit, cavernous room with the old water storage tanks, every nerve in my body felt electrified. The repeated, wet, stuck sound echoed off the concrete walls, and my mind struggled to make sense of what I was hearing. Whoever, or whatever, was making those footsteps was very real, and they were coming from just across the room. My flashlight beam wavered as I shined it back and forth, trying desperately to find the source of the noise. But the room was filled with shadows, and the light couldn't reach all the way to the far corners. Every surface glistened with moisture, and the beam seemed to fracture against the dripping pipes, adding to the confusion. Then, in one swift, heart-stopping moment, the beam of my flashlight landed on something. There, against the damp, peach-colored concrete wall, stood a human-shaped figure. It wasn't like any shadow I had ever seen. The figure was completely black, darker than the surrounding darkness, with no features or variation in shading. It was like a silhouette cut out of reality, and the contrast against the wall made it look even more unnatural. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat, and I forced out a shaky, "Hello?" hoping for some kind of response, anything to prove that this was just a person, some fellow explorer playing a prank. But the figure didn't move or respond. Instead, its eyes flashed. Two bright, reflective points of light stared back at me, catching the beam of my flashlight. The eyes seemed almost animalistic, and for a split second, I thought I saw them flicker, as if they blinked. The rest of the figure remained a perfect black void, absorbing the light without giving anything back. I couldn't make out a face, clothing, or any other features, just those haunting, reflective eyes, and the sense that something was very, very wrong. The air felt heavier, and the only sound was the slow drip of water from the tanks and the thudding of my heartbeat in my ears. Panic took over. I didn't think, I just reacted. My body was screaming at me to run, and without a second thought, I spun around and bolted up the sloping tunnel, the flashlight shaking wildly in my hand. The incline made it difficult to keep my footing, especially with the slick, damp concrete beneath me. My boots slid, and the water made a horrible sloshing noise as I scrambled to get away. The light from my flashlight danced chaotically off the walls, creating twisting shadows that made it feel like the darkness itself was chasing me. I slipped multiple times. The first fall was hard, and I went down on my hands and knees, the impact jarring my wrists and sending pain shooting up my arms. My right wrist bent awkwardly, and I felt a sharp, immediate sting that told me I had injured it badly. Gritting my teeth, I pushed myself up, ignoring the dull ache and the blood trickling from a cut on my knee. My jeans were torn, and the wound stung in the cold, damp air, but I couldn't stop. The sense of urgency, of needing to get out of there as fast as possible, was overwhelming. I kept running, slipping and stumbling, barely managing to keep my balance as I ascended the tunnel. Each time I fell, it took precious seconds to recover, and the fear of whatever was behind me only grew. The echoes of my movements seemed to follow me, bouncing off the walls and making it sound like something, or someone, was right on my heels. The flashlight flickered a few times, and my heart sank at the thought of it failing. The tunnel felt longer than I remembered, stretching on endlessly, and every second in that suffocating darkness felt like an eternity. Finally, I saw it, a faint, blessed hint of daylight streaming in from the entrance. The sight of it sent a fresh surge of adrenaline through my body, and I pushed myself even harder, ignoring the pain in my wrist and the throbbing in my knee. I burst out of the tunnel into the open air, gasping for breath, and collapsed onto the ground just outside. The cold wind hit me like a shock, but it was a welcome feeling, a reminder that I was no longer trapped underground. It took me several moments to catch my breath and steady myself. My hands were trembling, and my clothes were soaked and caked with mud. The cuts on my knee were deeper than I had realized, and blood was seeping through the fabric of my jeans. My wrist throbbed with a dull, persistent ache, and every breath came in ragged gasps. I kept glancing back at the tunnel entrance, half expecting that shadowy figure to emerge, but nothing came out. The tunnel remained dark and silent, as if it had swallowed up whatever I had seen and was content to keep it hidden. Even now, I still don't know what I encountered in those tunnels. The memory of those reflective eyes, the shadow that wasn't really a shadow, still sends chills down my spine. I've been back to the asylum since, but I've never gone alone again, and I always make sure to bring better equipment. I can't explain what I saw or how it made me feel, but the experience has left a lasting impression, a reminder of just how small and vulnerable we are in the face of the unknown. I was home alone for the first time in our new house. My parents had only recently moved us in, and the place still felt foreign, with half-empty rooms and boxes we hadn't gotten around to unpacking. It was the kind of house where the sound of your own footsteps echoed a little too loudly, where every creak of the floorboards seemed to linger in the air. Our neighborhood wasn't much better. It was a developing area, and aside from the occasional unfinished house wrapped in scaffolding, there were only a handful of families scattered down the quiet, dimly lit street. The empty lot next door made things even more unnerving. The shell of a house sat there, framed out but unfinished, with skeletal wooden beams and a dirt foundation littered with construction debris. It was the kind of place that looked spooky even in the daytime, but at night it was downright menacing. Shadows from the streetlights played tricks on the walls, and every gust of wind seemed to make the building groan. On top of that, my parents had an unfortunate habit of leaving the outdoor side garage door unlocked, a simple oversight that suddenly felt like a glaring security flaw. I had been sitting on the couch in our living room, the glow of the TV the only source of light in the large open space. The television provided a comforting background noise, something to drown out the unsettling quiet of the new house. But even as I tried to lose myself in whatever I was watching, there was always a small part of me that remained on edge, aware of how vulnerable I felt. The large, uncovered windows made me feel like I was on display, and I couldn't help but occasionally glance outside into the darkness. It was sometime in the evening, though I hadn't paid much attention to the clock. My mind was preoccupied, drifting between the TV and the checklist of things my mom had asked me to do. Put away the dishes, turn off the porch light before bed, make sure the back door was locked. The mundane details of the day were supposed to distract me from the quiet unease I felt, but they barely did the trick. Then, suddenly, I heard it. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the door that connected the garage to the house. The noise was subtle at first, like a soft scraping or a jiggle, but it was distinct enough to make me pause. I sat up a little straighter, reaching for the remote to mute the TV. The quiet that filled the room was oppressive, amplifying every small creak and groan of the house. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it, but then the sound came again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The doorknob was wiggling, as though someone was trying to open it. My heart started pounding so hard, I could hear it in my ears. I stared at the door, half expecting it to burst open right then and there. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it was the wind, or some kind of draft, or perhaps I had left something leaning against the door that had shifted. But deep down I knew better. The movement had been too deliberate, too purposeful. My mouth went dry, and a wave of panic set in. I tried to stand up quietly, as if any sudden movement might tip off whoever was on the other side that I was aware of them. In that moment, I realized how unprepared I was. The house phone was nowhere in sight. My parents had never had a designated spot for it, and I was notorious for leaving it in random places after long conversations with friends. I began frantically searching for it, running my hands over the coffee table, lifting up stray magazines, and looking behind the couch cushions. My cell phone was out of the question. It was in my parents' car, charging, because I had forgotten to bring it inside earlier. The frustration of that oversight only added to my growing fear. As I searched, I became painfully aware of how exposed I was. The kitchen and living room had no blinds or curtains yet, just wide, bare windows that looked out onto the dark street and the empty lot next door. If someone was standing outside, they could see every single move I made. The thought was paralyzing. I felt like a fish in a bowl, completely visible and utterly defenseless. Every shadow outside suddenly seemed more sinister, and every creak in the house felt like an approaching threat. The silence pressed in on me, and I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the distant ticking of a clock somewhere down the hall. The house felt enormous and empty, and each passing second without finding the phone made me more desperate. My mind raced through what-ifs, imagining all the ways this night could go horribly wrong. My hands started to shake, and the room, which had once seemed so spacious, now felt like a trap, with too many ways for danger to get in and too few ways for me to get out. I tried to think clearly, to calm myself down, but the sound of the doorknob moving replayed in my mind over and over. I was exposed. I was alone, and I had no way of calling for help. I knew that if I didn't come up with a plan soon, I could be in serious trouble. The pounding on the front door was relentless, echoing through the house in heavy, threatening thuds. Each impact made the door rattle in its frame, and I could almost feel the vibrations in the floor beneath me. My whole body was tense, my hands shaking as I clutched the cordless phone I had finally managed to find. My heart pounded so hard that it felt like it might burst out of my chest, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady. I had dialed 911 and was whispering frantically into the phone, trying to explain what was happening while staying as quiet as possible. As I waited for the operator to confirm that help was on the way, I couldn't help but feel trapped. The house, which had felt so open and exposed just minutes earlier, now felt like a cage. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the house settling, seemed louder and more ominous. The air felt heavy with fear, and the darkness outside the windows seemed to press in, making the inside of the house feel smaller and more vulnerable. I tried to think of anything else I could do to protect myself, but my mind felt scrambled, a mess of panicked thoughts and worst-case scenarios. I had seen those two figures pacing in front of the house, and the way they moved replayed in my mind. They hadn't looked confused or lost. They had looked determined, agitated. The memory made me feel sick, like I was a target in their sights and they wouldn't leave until they got what they wanted. The sound of their footsteps on the porch had been bad enough, but the banging was on a whole different level. It wasn't random or panicked. It was forceful, methodical, as if they were testing the strength of the door, looking for any weakness. I imagined the door giving way, splinters flying as it burst open, and I tried to push the thought out of my mind. I couldn't afford to freeze up or panic more than I already was. Every detail around me seemed amplified. The dim hallway light cast long shadows on the walls, making the space feel distorted and unfamiliar. The smell of my mom's perfume lingered faintly in the bedroom, mixed with the scent of clean laundry that hadn't been put away yet. I could hear the distant hum of the refrigerator downstairs, an ordinary noise that now felt strange and out of place against the chaos unfolding around me. It was like the house was trying to pretend everything was normal, but the violent banging at the door shattered that illusion. As I crouched in the dark corner of my parents' bedroom, I kept replaying the steps I had taken to get here, wondering if I had made the right choices. Should I have run outside instead of hiding upstairs? Was there some other place in the house where I would be safer? I couldn't shake the feeling that every decision I made could mean the difference between safety and danger, and the weight of that responsibility was crushing. The window in the hallway still loomed in my mind. I had seen the two figures through that window, moving back and forth with an unsettling intensity. Even though I had only glimpsed them for a few seconds, the image was burned into my memory. One of them had been tall, with a bulky frame that seemed to take up too much space. The other was smaller, but no less intimidating, moving with a nervous energy that made me think they were just as desperate as they were dangerous. It was clear they were working together, and that thought alone made my fear even worse. I couldn't afford to make noise, but the adrenaline coursing through my veins made it nearly impossible to stay still. My foot tapped lightly against the hardwood floor, and I quickly stopped, horrified that even the smallest sound might give me away. I checked the lock on the bedroom door, feeling the cold metal under my fingers, and wondered if it would hold if someone really tried to force their way in. The bedroom felt both like a sanctuary and a trap, offering some protection but also nowhere to run if things got worse. The dispatcher on the phone was calm, asking me for details I could barely string together. I described the banging, the figures I had seen, the fact that the house was new and vulnerable. I tried to keep my voice steady, but it cracked every time there was a particularly loud thump from downstairs. The operator assured me that officers were on their way, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time was moving too slowly, that they might not get here in time. Suddenly, the banging stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating, and I strained to hear any movement. My ears felt like they were ringing from the sudden lack of noise, and I held my breath, terrified of what might come next. The quiet was somehow more unsettling than the pounding, as if the intruders were regrouping, planning their next move. I crept a little closer to the window in my parents' room, just enough to peek through a small gap in the blinds. The street outside looked deceptively calm. The half-built house next door was nothing but a shadowy outline, and there was no sign of anyone running away. The night felt thick and oppressive, and I could almost sense the tension hanging in the air. My stomach twisted as I wondered if they had given up, or if they were preparing to try something even more dangerous. The waiting was excruciating, and the fear of the unknown gnawed at me, making every second feel like an hour. I clutched the cordless phone so tightly that my knuckles were white, pressing it to my ear as if the sound of the 911 dispatcher's voice could somehow shield me from whatever was outside. The banging had stopped, but the silence that replaced it was even worse. I sat in the pitch-black closet of my parents' bedroom, trying to make myself as small and invisible as possible. The closet was cramped, packed with my mom's hanging clothes that brushed against my face, smelling faintly of her floral detergent. The darkness inside was almost comforting, like a thin veil between me and the chaos outside, but it did little to ease my fear. I barely dared to breathe, and every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The slow creak of the house settling felt like a warning. The muffled hum of the refrigerator drifted up from the kitchen, a normal sound that seemed out of place in the tension-filled silence. Even the faint rustle of fabric as I shifted to make myself more comfortable seemed loud, and I winced, half expecting the noise to give away my hiding spot. My ears strained to pick up any hint of movement, any sign that the intruders had made their way inside, but all I could hear was my own heart hammering in my chest. The 911 dispatcher assured me that officers were en route, but even as I listened, I couldn't stop my mind from racing. How long would it take for them to get here? Would they arrive in time? Every second felt agonizingly slow, and I kept glancing at the closet door, half expecting it to fly open at any moment. I ran through a mental list of escape routes, wondering if I could climb out the window and onto the porch roof, or if that would only make me more vulnerable. I hated feeling so helpless, so trapped. Then, a new sound broke the silence. It was subtle at first, almost like a whisper, but unmistakable, the creak of a floorboard. My blood ran cold. It came from downstairs, near the front door, and I knew that someone had stepped inside. My grip on the phone tightened as I tried to stay calm, but my mind was a blur of fear and confusion. The dispatcher was still talking, asking me questions, but their voice sounded far away. I barely registered what they were saying as I tried to focus on the noises coming from below. The footsteps were careful, almost methodical, as if whoever was in the house was trying to move quietly but couldn't completely mask their presence. They made their way through the entryway, pausing now and then, and each pause felt like a lifetime. I imagined them looking around, deciding which room to check next. The sound of a drawer being pulled open made me flinch, and I could hear the clinking of something, maybe keys or loose change, being moved around. They were searching for something. My breathing grew shallow as I listened. It wasn't just one person. I could hear the faint rustling of more than one intruder moving through the house. I pictured them creeping through the living room, past the furniture we hadn't even had time to arrange properly, their footsteps muffled by the area rugs that had only been put down a week ago. I couldn't tell where they would go next, but the unpredictability of their movements was paralyzing. I tried to stay as still as possible, the closet feeling smaller and more suffocating with every second. Just when I thought I couldn't handle it anymore, a new noise cut through the tension: sirens. The wailing sound grew louder, filling the street outside with a burst of hope. Relief washed over me, but I knew I wasn't safe yet. The footsteps inside the house stopped abruptly, and there was a moment of complete silence. I imagined the intruders realizing that the police were close, weighing their options, deciding whether to flee or fight. My pulse raced as I waited for what would happen next. The sirens blared, echoing off the surrounding houses, and I could hear the engines of the police cars rumbling as they pulled up to the curb. Flashing red and blue lights lit up the street, casting moving patterns on the walls of the upstairs hallway. I heard car doors slam and officers shouting commands, their voices clear and authoritative. The tension in the air shifted, and I held my breath, hoping that the presence of law enforcement would be enough to drive the intruders away. I stayed crouched in the closet, listening to the officers move through the house, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. They called out, announcing themselves, and I could hear them searching every room. My heart started to slow, but I still didn't feel safe enough to move. Finally, I heard one of them calling up the stairs, letting me know it was okay to come out. The relief was overwhelming, but my body felt stiff and reluctant to leave the small, dark space that had become my shield. When I finally stepped out of the closet, the reality of what had happened hit me all at once. My legs felt weak, and my hands were still trembling as I made my way downstairs. The officers were there, their flashlights sweeping through every corner, but the intruders were gone. The broken glass on the floor was a stark reminder of how close I had come to real danger. The police assured me they would patrol the area and stay for a while to make sure everything was secure. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the intruders were still out there, lurking in the shadows just beyond the reach of the flashing lights. It took hours for my heart to finally settle, and even then, the sense of unease lingered. I knew I'd never forget the feeling of being hunted in my own home, the vulnerability of being alone and unprepared. It would be a long time before I'd feel truly safe again.